On the 8th and 9th of November 1923, the future dictator Adolf Hitler made his first attempt to seize power in Germany. He and his followers stormed a Munich beer hall, declared the government of the Weimar Republic deposed, and announced the resurrection of a strong Germany under authoritarian leadership. However, the so-called Beerhall Putsch had been poorly prepared and even more poorly executed. Less than 24 hours after it had begun, the attempted uprising ended in a shootout with the Bavarian police. Hitler was arrested and his party was subsequently banned. With that, the National Socialist movement had been driven out of the German political scene for the time being. For many contemporaries, this attempted uprising by an Austrian good-for-nothing with anger issues and his small party was an almost laughable affair. The newspapers reported on a circus scene, a spectre, and a clown show. The actors themselves were described as being amateurs of the worst kind. Now, I do not wish to cast any doubt on the accuracy of these statements, but nevertheless, Hitler's coup was a far greater event than the Germans realized immediately after it had ended. Today, we know that Hitler was just a small fish in a vast and powerful network of anti-democratic conspirators who wanted to bring about the downfall of the German Republic in 1923. This network posed the greatest threat to democracy at that time, and ironically, it was Hitler who brought it down. Today, we're going to take a look at the fascinating history of the Beerhall Putsch and explain the desire for a dictator among large sections of the German population, the plans for a coup by the extreme right, and why the Weimar democracy ultimately managed to prevail. I think it is no exaggeration to say that from the moment the Republic was proclaimed and the Kaiser had abdicated, there were calls in Germany for a return to an authoritarian system. Many hoped that the country would be ruled by a charismatic leader who would restore Germany to national greatness. They couldn't or didn't want to come to terms with the Republic because they associated it with defeat in the First World War, saw it as nothing but a source of unrest, and despised the Democrats in government, whom they regarded as traitors. This sentiment prevailed primarily among the political right, and as early as the spring of 1920, opponents of the Republic from the Prussian nobility and the military attempted to seize power in the so-called Putsch. Their coup attempt failed due to the workers and the trade unions who called a general strike, paralysed the country, and defeated the conspirators after only a couple of days. It became very clear that the number of Republican supporters was far greater than that of their opponents, but plans for a coup continued to be hatched nonetheless. But the anti-democratic right was by no means united and could be divided into two large groups. On the one hand, you had the monarchists, and on the other, the racialist groups who wanted to unite the country under an ethnically homogeneous people's community and decide strict dictatorial leadership. But ultimately, their goals amounted to the same thing: the closure of the Reichstag, the removal of the people from the political process, and the abolition of the parliamentary republic. Such ideas gained particular traction in 1923, which is considered to be the absolute crisis year and is also known as the Madhouse period. It all began in January of 1923, when French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr area under the pretext that Germany was falling behind with its reparations payments. The German government responded by initiating passive resistance and calling on the occupied population not to cooperate with the French and Belgians and to refuse to work. In addition to the high human cost of around 132 deaths, the fight over the Ruhr area was also fatal for Germany in economic terms. With the occupation of the Ruhr region, Germany lost one of its most important industrial areas, which led to massive revenue losses. In addition, the government now had to pay for the maintenance of 2 million unemployed people who had lost their income as a result of the resistance. Germany found it increasingly difficult to plug this financial hole, and inflation, which had already begun during the First World War, now reached absolutely unimaginable proportions due to the constant increase in the money supply in circulation. At the end of 1922, $1 was worth around 4,000 marks, but by November 1923, $1 cost a staggering 4.2 trillion marks. Food prices skyrocketed and millions of Germans had no choice but to watch as their hard-earned savings accumulated over many years became worthless in just a few months. Many lost faith in the economic system and became alienated from the democratic system. The disorientation and trauma caused by hyperinflation cannot be overestimated. However, a few people profited and were able to amass huge fortunes because they owned secure investments, such as real estate, industries, and large land estates. The most notorious example of this was the industrialist Hugo Stinnes, who was able to build an empire of over 1,500 companies in a very short time frame. The social misery caused by hyperinflation provided a fertile ground for unrest and conflict. In October of 1923, separatists in the Rhineland proclaimed the Rhenish Republic with the partial support of France. In Thuringia and Saxony, an attempt at a communist coup was thwarted, but a communist uprising broke out in Hamburg. Germany was in danger of sinking into complete chaos, and calls for a dictatorship grew louder. Right-wing anti-democrats repeatedly took Italy as their role model. The year before, Benito Mussolini had mobilized his private fascist army and ordered it to march towards the outskirts of Rome. The crisis-ridden Italian government, under Luigi Facta, declared a state of siege and drafted a decree that would enable the army to strike immediately against the fascists. However, King Vittorio Emanuele III refused to sign the decree, which caused the Facta cabinet to resign. After a few half-hearted attempts to prevent Mussolini from seizing power, the king appointed him prime minister. This sealed the end of liberal Italy and brought the era of democratization there to an abrupt end. Many believe that something similar should also happen in Germany. The national conservative historian Karl Alexander von Müller recalled that there was repeated talk in academic circles of the necessity of a dictatorship and that very many, perhaps even most Germans, emotionally expect salvation from a single great individual. In the autumn of 1923, the right-wing intellectual Arthur Möller-Vandenbroek published the book Das Dritte Reich, or The Third Reich, in which he outlined an alternative to the parliamentary system. We need popular leaders whom we do not even need to ask which party they belong to, because their party is Germany from the outset, he wrote. Such voices could also be heard in the business world. Hugo Stinnes, for example, believed that only the abolition of the 8-hour day could save the German economy. But because the workers naturally resisted this, they would have to be forced into it. He explained to the American ambassador, Alanson Houghton, that is why a dictator must be found, equipped with the power to do whatever is necessary. Such a man must speak the language of the people and be a bourgeois himself. Nowhere was this desire for a dictatorship stronger than in Bavaria, or more precisely, in Munich. To understand why this was the case, we need to take a brief look at Bavaria's history after the end of the First World War. Like everywhere else in Germany, the November Revolution of 1918 in Bavaria was initially bloodless. The rule of the Wittelsbach dynasty came to an end when the independent Social Democrat Kurt Eisner proclaimed the Free State of Bavaria on the 8th of November. A transitional government was then formed, consisting of the Social Democratic Party and the Independent Social Democratic Party, which proved to be fairly stable. Elections to the state parliament were scheduled for January 1919, and Eisner remained Bavarian Prime Minister until then. Although Eisner was a Democrat and strongly rejected revolutionary views, he quickly became the target of anti-Semitic and nationalist agitation. He was assassinated on the 21st of February by a suspended lieutenant and nationalist. Eisner's death triggered a spiral of radicalization, violence, and instability in Bavaria. The new minority government, led by the Social Democrats, proved to be ineffective, partly because the various interest groups in the state parliament repeatedly blocked each other. At the beginning of April, anarchist and socialist intellectuals proclaimed the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which was overthrown after only a week by leading members of the Communist Party. Power in Munich was thus held by 3 communists from Russia. The fact that 2 of them were also Jewish was more wind in the sails of right-wing nationalist propaganda, which spread fear of so-called Jewish Bolshevism. The Soviet Republic was short-lived, as government troops crushed it in early May and enabled the government to return from its exile in Bamberg. The spring of 1919 was characterized by traumatic violence. The Red Terror, which had culminated at the end of April with the murder of 10 hostages at the Luitpold Gymnasium, was followed by the White Terror, as a result of which the Freikorps troops acted with the utmost cruelty against anyone they considered to be a revolutionary. By the end of this orgy of violence, up to 1,000 people had been killed, many of them innocent bystanders. The experiences during the revolution and counter-revolution alienated many residents of Munich from parliamentary democracy. In their eyes, it would only lead to moral decay and open the door to Bolshevism. The political culture of debate among the bourgeoisie was subsequently dominated by anti-Semitism, rejection of the revolution, and fear of Bolshevism. In the Kapp-Ludwig-Putsch of 1920, the Bavarian government, led by a social democrat, was put under pressure by the army as well as paramilitary units to resign. The national conservative and monarchist Gustav von Kahr then became the new minister-president. When he took office, he announced strict measures against foreign infiltration by non-members of the nation, keeping the native population free of foreign elements, and the creation of an Order Cell Bavaria as a counterweight to Republican Berlin. The once so liberal Munich thus became the capital of German nationalist, anti-Semitic and racialist forces. It also became the preferred place of retreat for all right-wing extremist revolutionaries, violent criminals and political murderers from all over Germany. Even though Kahr resigned in the autumn of 1921, Munich remained a mecca for all those who wanted to overthrow the Weimar Republic. It was therefore no coincidence that a party that we should all be familiar with was able to flourish in this atmosphere: the National Socialist German Workers' Party. After Adolf Hitler had asserted his claim to leadership of the party in July 1921, he succeeded in building it into a force to be reckoned with, especially in Bavaria. On the one hand, this was due to his oratory skills, for Hitler had a distinct talent for captivating his listeners with his hate-filled tirades and drawing them under his spell. Mussolini's seizure of power was also a source of inspiration for him, and towards the end of 1922, he seems to have seen himself in the role of the man who would lead Germany to new greatness. His followers agreed with him on this point. In November of 1922, Hermann Esser, the NSDAP's propaganda chief, proclaimed during a speech in the Löwenbräu Keller, "What a group of courageous men managed to do in Italy, we can do in Bavaria as well. We too have Italy's Mussolini. He is called Adolf Hitler." Following Mussolini's example, who was called Duce by his supporters, Hitler also took on the title of Führer in 1923. In any case, the crisis year of 1923 ensured that the membership of the NSDAP continued to rise. Between January and November, the party grew from around 8,000 to over 55,000 members. Hitler continued to rail against the November criminals and the traitors in Berlin who had allegedly caused the downfall of Germany. By the autumn of 1923, at the latest, he had finally come to the conclusion that the government must be overthrown and that he and his followers must take power in the country. Hitler also received support for his plans from outside the NSDAP. In August, he travelled to Switzerland, supposedly for study purposes. In fact, however, he was there to try to raise funds for his movement. On the 30th of August, he spoke at a villa in Zurich to a distinguished group of Swiss officers, businessmen and Germans living in the country. The host was the former head of the Swiss army, General Ulrich Wille, whose son was an ardent admirer of the National Socialists. In his speech, Hitler painted a bleak picture of Germany, claiming that the country was sliding towards disaster. Recovery, he said, could only come through a dictatorship. He then painted a terrifying picture of a communist uprising that would engulf Germany and then spill over into Switzerland. Only the National Socialists, he claimed, could avert this. The general's wife later wrote in her diary, "The whole man trembles when he speaks. He speaks wonderfully." Ulrich Wille, on the other hand, was less impressed. "For God's sake, why does that man have to shout all the time?" he said after the meeting. Hitler also gave speeches in other cities in Switzerland, and in the end he realized that the effort had been worth it. In total, he received perhaps as much as 30,000 Swiss francs in donations, which was hard currency of enormous value in inflation-ridden Germany. This enabled the Nazis to continue financing their agitation in Munich and gave them the upper edge over all the other parties in the city. In September, almost the entire Bavarian right gathered in Nuremberg for a ceremonial German Day. There, Hitler and Erich Ludendorff, the former commander-in-chief of the German army in World War I, joined forces. Ludendorff was a man who occupied a central position within the German right and served as a figure of identification. He had always been an opponent of the Republic and had worked relentlessly since 1918 to undermine it. He rejected responsibility for the defeat in World War I and spread the rumour that the German army had been stabbed in the back by subversive forces. He was also active in nationalist circles and heavily supported the coup-Ludendorff Putsch in 1920. The elderly general and the Austrian demagogue agreed that there must be a march on Berlin so that they could seize dictatorial power. In addition, the SA, the Bund Oberland and the Reichsflagge formed a paramilitary alliance in Nuremberg, the German Combat League, whose leadership was then taken over by Hitler himself. This gave the NSDAP a considerable military force at its disposal. But things turned out very differently than Hitler and his followers had imagined. The German government under Gustav Stresemann recognized that the strategy of passive resistance against the Ruhr occupation was futile and was only incurring horrendous costs. On the 26th of September, Stresemann announced the end of passive resistance in the hopes of reaching an agreement with France. Although this was clearly the only reasonable decision, the government in Berlin was denounced as traitor to the people by the national right wing. The Bavarian state government, carried by the Bavarian People's Party, declared a state of emergency on the same day and transferred executive power to Gustav von Kahr. It justified this by claiming that the mood in Bavaria was particularly agitated after the news of the end of the passive resistance, and that only Kahr, due to his relationship with right-wing organizations, could restore any sort of calm. The government in Berlin responded by declaring a state of emergency throughout the entire country and transferring executive power to Minister of Defense Otto Gessler. The government should then have forced Bavaria to revoke its measures. However, Stresemann and the bourgeois members of his cabinet assumed that this appeal would not be heeded in Munich anyway and did not want the whole affair to escalate into a violent confrontation. Only the Social Democrats in the cabinet continued to demand that Bavaria be forced to lift its state of emergency, as otherwise anti-republican forces in the rest of Germany could follow Bavaria's example. But they were unable to prevail. Instead, the conflict between Munich and Berlin only continued to escalate. On the 27th of September, the Völkischer Beobachter, the mouthpiece of the NSDAP, published an article in which Chancellor Stresemann and the head of the army command, Hans von Seeckt, were fiercely attacked because the former was married to a Jewish woman and the latter to a half-Jewish woman. The government then ordered a ban on the newspaper, but Gustav von Kahr refused to enforce it. Things got even worse when, on the 1st of October, General Otto von Lossow, commander of the Bavarian Reichswehr troops, also refused to enforce the ban on the Völkischer Beobachter against Kahr's will. This was a clear case of insubordination, and the Ministry of Defense had thus lost control of Bavaria. By now at the latest, it would have been absolutely necessary to march into Bavaria, but that was not an option. The head of the army command, Hans von Seeckt, flatly refused to take action against Bavaria. This demonstrates one of the greatest difficulties facing the Weimar Republic, the ambiguous loyalty of its own army. Many generals and officers in the Reichswehr had risen through the ranks of the imperial army, and were only conditionally supportive of democracy. One of the most notorious cases was Hans von Seeckt himself, who had already refused to send the army against the insurrectionists during the coup-Ludendorff Putsch in 1920. And this time too, he refused to cooperate and to send in the army against the rebellious commander of the Bavarian troops. Instead, he toyed with the idea of a dictatorship and was in constant contact with right-wing nationalist circles throughout the autumn. An open breach of the constitution was too far for him, but in principle, he would have welcomed the establishment of a dictatorship by legal means, for example through a directorate appointed by the president with full powers. This left the government's hands tied, and in Bavaria the conspirators were able to continue hatching their plans. In the meantime, a triumvirate was formed in Bavaria, consisting of Gustav von Kahr, Otto von Lossow, and the head of the Bavarian police, Hans von Seisser. The triumvirate's goal was to establish a national dictatorship in Berlin, and to achieve this goal, they intensified the military training of the Bavarian defense forces. In mid-October, Lieutenant Colonel Hermann Kriebel, acting on behalf of the triumvirate, drew up the so-called Border Protection Order, which contained a plan of attack against Berlin and regulated in detail the procedures and tasks of the individual troops. At the same time, the triumvirate made contacts with conspiratorial forces in northern Germany and further escalated the conflict with Berlin. Because Lossow had refused to obey the order to ban the Völkischer Beobachter, he was relieved of his post as commander of his 7th Division. Bavaria then simply assigned this division to itself and appointed Lossow as its commander. There had never been such an open breach of the constitution in the entire history of United Germany. The Munich Military District Command then ordered the paramilitary units of the German Combat League to be integrated into the Reichswehr division. The pretext for this was that they wanted to establish a defensive force against the left-wing governments in neighbouring Saxony and Thuringia. By the end of October, all preparations had been completed, and the days of the Weimar Republic seemed to be numbered. In order to be prepared against any unpleasant surprises, Seisser travelled to Berlin to meet with Hans von Seeckt. Although Seeckt supported the plans for the establishment of a dictatorship, he also made it clear that he would not support a violent coup originating in Bavaria. Instead, he hoped that President Friedrich Ebert might lose confidence in the Stresemann government and instead establish a directorate with dictatorial powers by means of an emergency decree, which would be better equipped to deal with the state crisis. Seeckt did want a dictatorship, but he wanted it to be established by legal means. However, Ebert was not prepared to take such a step and stood by his chancellor. Seeckt didn't want to risk a showdown with the president and therefore advised the Bavarians to wait and see how the political situation in Berlin would develop. Seeing that it wouldn't have the support of Hans von Seeckt, the Munich triumvirate temporarily called off its plans so as not to risk possible conflicts with the Reichswehr troops that had been stationed in Saxony after the ousting of the local government consisting of Social Democrats and Communists. Without the support of the German army, the triumvirate realized that any coup attempt would be completely futile. The big question for Hitler was what role he and the Nazis should play in the whole undertaking. After all, the SA was also supposed to take part in the planned march and had been training in Bavarian Reichswehr barracks since October. But there was no real agreement on the plans between the triumvirate and Hitler because both sides greatly distrusted each other. They couldn't agree on who should take part in the dictatorial directorate after the takeover, and Hitler insisted that he should play an important role in it. But that was out of the question for the triumvirate. After all, despite its strong growth, the NSDAP was still a small party, and in Munich, Kahr, Lossow and Seisser had the reins in their hands. Hitler was merely to be used as a pawn, make his contribution, and then disappear back into insignificance where he belongs. As the days went by, Hitler was becoming increasingly impatient and could not understand why the triumvirate did not finally make a move. In his eyes, the chances for a successful coup were dwindling with each passing day. Firstly, after the army had marched into Saxony and Thuringia, the pretext for mobilization at the Bavarian border disappeared, and secondly, the government in Berlin had taken an important step towards ending hyperinflation with the establishment of the Rentenbank. The nationwide crisis, which had been so essential for the growth of the NSDAP, was coming to an end. Stresemann and his government seemed to be slowly getting the situation under control. Hitler and his followers could no longer wait. The Swiss donation fund and other party savings had been used up, and the fighters in the German Combat League finally wanted to carry out the long-promised March on Berlin. Hitler therefore decided that he himself would have to take the initiative and force the Bavarian elites to act. The triumvirate had announced a mass meeting in Munich's Bürgerbräukeller for the 8th of November, and Hitler decided that this is when he would strike. Hitler's plan was to storm the meeting, occupy the Bürgerbräukeller, take Munich's entire political elite hostage, and then give the starting signal for the March on Berlin. He later explained that he wanted to give the three procrastinators a little push so that they would finally jump into the water that seemed too cold for them. The plan was risky, and the Nazis had little time to plan it. But in Hitler's eyes, it was to be their last chance. On the 8th of November, at 8 p.m, Kahr, Lossow and Seisser arrived at the packed Bürgerbräukeller. Kahr began his moderately interesting speech on Marxism, and a few minutes later Hitler drove up to the Bürgerbräukeller with a few companions. A number of SA men under Hermann Göring's command cordoned off the building on all sides. Hitler went into the foyer, paced nervously back and forth and sipped a glass of beer. Then, at 8:45 p.m, he drew his pistol and stormed into the hall with his companions. He made his way to the speaker's podium, climbed onto a chair and fired a shot into the ceiling. Then he shouted, "The national revolution has broken out. The hall is occupied by 600 heavily armed men. No one is allowed to leave the hall. If there is no immediate silence, I will have a machine gun placed on the gallery. The Bavarian government has been deposed. The Reich government has been deposed. A provisional Reich government will be formed." He then asked K., Lossow and Seisser to accompany him to an adjoining room and promised them that he would ensure their safety. There, Hitler attempted to win the triumvirate over to his side and presented his vision of a government under his leadership. When this failed to convince them, Hitler showed them his pistol and threatened that he had saved the 4 bullets for them and himself. But even that did not work. "You can arrest me, you can shoot me dead. Dying or not dying is meaningless," K. replied. Meanwhile, there was a huge commotion in the hall and people were wondering what in God's name was actually going on. Göring tried to calm the crowd, but his crude manner only seemed to incite them further. Hitler then felt compelled to take control of the situation himself. He used all of his talents as an orator and mass manipulator to win over the audience. At the end, he asked the question, "Outside are Mr. K., Mr. Lossow and Mr. Seisser. They are struggling with the decision. Can I tell them that you will stand behind them?" The audience responded with an enthusiastic "Yes, yes." The mood in the Bürgerbräukeller lifted even more when Erich Ludendorff appeared in uniform. Ludendorff went into the adjoining room and persuaded the triumvirate to join them. Lossow, an old comrade in arms, was the first to give his consent. Seisser then followed suit. K. also agreed after Hitler gave his vague promise to enable a return of the monarchy. The men then returned to the podium and received thunderous applause. Hitler gave another rousing speech. "In the coming weeks and months, I intend to fulfill what I vowed 5 years ago when I lay in the military hospital as a blind cripple, not to rest or relax until the criminals of November 1918 are brought to their knees. From the ruins of today's miserable Germany, a Germany of power and greatness, of freedom and glory will rise again. Amen." Then he shook hands with each of the people on stage and the German national anthem was sung. So far, everything was going according to plan, but the putsch attempt collapsed almost immediately afterwards. Hitler left the Bürgerbräukeller for a short time because he heard that there were difficulties with the occupation of a barracks nearby. When he returned, K., Lossow and Seisser were gone. Ludendorff had let them go on the promise that they would stick to the agreement. The triumvirate had merely put on a brave face and turned their backs on the Nazis at the first possible opportunity. Due to their poor planning, Hitler and his conspirators had no idea what to do next. The triumvirate met at 1 a.m. and drafted a telegram that was sent to all German radio stations at 2:50 a.m. In it they expressed their rejection of Hitler's coup. In a second telegram a few hours later, the three reported that both the barracks and other important buildings in the city were not in the hands of the rebels. On that fateful night in Munich, there was also a brief glimpse of what would happen throughout Germany 10 years later. The Nazi troops believed that they were in control and immediately began terrorizing members of the left and Jews. They ransacked the editorial offices of the Social Democratic Münchener Post and took several hostages. Among the hostages were Erhard Auer, editor-in-chief of the Münchener Post, and his family, Ludwig Wassermann, chairman of the Central Association of German Citizens of the Jewish Faith in Munich, Eduard Schmid, a social democratic politician, and other left-wing city councillors from Munich. Only the rapid collapse of the coup prevented worse from happening. In the early hours of the 9th of November, it became clear to the conspirators that their plan had failed. The triumvirate, the army and the police had opposed the coup. After hours of discussion, Ludendorff suggested marching to the city centre in an attempt to win over the public's opinion. Around noon, the procession of about 2,000 men, led by Hitler and Ludendorff, was on the move. The troops marched from the Bürgerbräukeller to the Ludwigsbrücke, then through the Isar-Tor to the Marienplatz. The column then turned into Weinstraße and marched through Theatinerstraße towards the Odeonsplatz with the monumental Feldherrnhalle. However, a police post was already waiting for them there. A firefight broke out, leaving 14 insurrectionists and 4 police officers dead. Ludendorff allowed himself to be arrested on the spot, while Hitler initially managed to escape, but was arrested 2 days later. Other plotters were able to flee to Austria. On the 9th of November, Kahr banned the NSDAP, as well as the German Combat League. However, in order to appease the right wing, he also banned the Communist Party 2 days later. 2 weeks later, Hans von Seeckt, who had been given executive power during the attempted coup, followed suit. The NSDAP and the Communist Party were banned throughout the Reich. But the radical parties did not need to fear a permanent ban, as these measures were only intended to last for the duration of the state of emergency. The NSDAP, for example, was already legalized again in February of 1925. After the Beerhall Putsch had failed, it would have been the duty of the justice system to punish this high treason appropriately and to ensure that Hitler and his henchmen could never again pose a threat to democracy. But instead, the trial of the conspirators became one of the most glaring examples of the Weimar Republic's inability to adequately defend itself against a threat from the right. This began with the decision as to where the trial should even take place. Normally, the State Court for the Protection of the Republic in Leipzig would have been responsible for cases of high treason. But the Triumvirate did not want to allow this under any circumstances, because important figures from the Bavarian elite had been actively involved in Hitler's attempted coup. Furthermore, they did not want to risk the trial revealing how far the preparations for a coup d'etat originating in Bavaria had already progressed, or what plans Kahr, Lossow and Seisser had hatched up in the run-up to the 8th of November. There were already rumours about this in the rest of Germany. The Berlin-based Vossische Zeitung wrote, "When you dig deeper into the events, Mr. von Kahr turns out to be the one who is really to blame, because he merely showed Hitler and Ludendorff what they then went on to imitate. In order to avoid any unnecessary attention and to be able to shift all responsibility onto Hitler, the trial had to take place in Bavaria. It was therefore only logical that the Bavarian authorities did not comply with the state court's arrest warrant. Once again, the German government gave in to Bavaria in order to prevent the conflict from escalating further. The trial of the leaders of the putsch took place at the Munich 1 People's Court from February to March 1924. In the run-up to the trial, a deal was most likely struck between Hitler and the prosecution. In return for Hitler not mentioning the involvement of the Bavarian elite and the secret mobilization in the public trial, the prosecution agreed to charge him only with high treason and to exclude the deaths at the Odeonsplatz and the kidnapped hostages from the proceedings. He was also promised a lenient sentence. The trial was therefore a farce from the very outset. The judge allowed Hitler to give hours of propaganda speeches in the courtroom and also permitted him to make offensive remarks about the Reich government and the president. At the end of this theatre, Hitler received a sentence of 5 years of imprisonment. Contrary to what German law would have stipulated, Hitler would not be deported to Austria. This was justified by his alleged love of his country and his participation in the First World War in the German army. Ludendorff himself was released without any sort of punishment. The trial was a scandal and caused a nationwide uproar in Germany because justice had evidently not been served. Hitler served his sentence under comfortable conditions in Landsberg and was released as early as Christmas 1924. He used his time in prison to write Mein Kampf, a propagandistic autobiography intended to describe the development of his worldview. Kahr, Lossow and Seisser never faced any consequences for their actions, and the Munich Public Prosecutor's Office dropped the investigation against them. However, in July 1924, Wilhelm Hügner, a Social Democratic member of the Bavarian State Parliament, succeeded in pushing through the establishment of a committee of inquiry. But it was not until October 1927 that the committee held its first meeting. Its work was constantly hampered by the conservative governing parties and authorities, who used imaginative delaying tactics and withheld necessary documents. Finally, in April 1928, the committee was able to present its 2 reports. The report that was accepted by the Bavarian parliament denied any involvement by Bavarian officials, but Hübner's own report clearly demonstrated their involvement. Hübner's full report was only published a few years ago. So, what were the consequences of the Beerhall Putsch? First of all, the debacle weakened the authority of the Bavarian triumvirate, and their support among the population dwindled drastically. In February of 1924, both Kahr and Lossow resigned from their posts, and the conflict between Bavaria and the German government was finally resolved. The rebellious Reichswehr division was reintegrated into the rest of the army. Whereas national, conservative and racialist circles had often worked together until that point, they now began to increasingly distance themselves from each other. Although Bavaria was the birthplace of the Nazi movement, in the following years the NSDAP found it difficult to establish itself as the dominating mass movement. Instead, the party's focus increasingly shifted to the rural areas of northern and eastern Germany. Hitler himself had unintentionally strengthened the Weimar Republic that he so despised with his coup because he had thwarted the Bavarian plans for a revolution and severely discredited the right-wing conservatives. He also learned that he could not seize power through violent confrontation with the state, like his role model Mussolini had done. Instead, he maintained the appearance of legality and rebuilt his power base within the Republican state apparatus. Unfortunately, his strategy proved to be successful. After Hitler had seized power in 1933, the failed coup was stylized into a cult event and glorified as the actual birth of the NSDAP. For example, the swastika flag that had been carried during the march in 1923 and had allegedly caught the blood of the fallen was elevated to the status of a relic. On the 10th anniversary of the event, the regime issued the so-called Blood Order, which was one of the highest honors of the Nazi era and was primarily intended for the participants in the coup. The Feldherrnhalle, where the shootout with the Bavarian police had taken place, became a place of worship. A plaque dedicated to the dead insurrectionists was attached to the east side. On the back was the inscription, "And yet you have triumphed." The plaque was guarded by an SS honor guard, and every passerby was required to greet it with a Hitler salute. Those who did not want to do so could take a detour through Viscardigasse, which runs behind the Feldherrnhalle. After a while, the small alley became known locally as the Drückerberger Gasse, which translates to Schurke's Alley. Munich itself was designated the capital of the movement, and the entire city became an icon of National Socialism. In 1935, the two so-called Temples of Honor were opened on the Königsplatz, where the remains of the putschists were buried. Every year, on the 9th of November, a meticulously planned spectacle was staged in the city, and commemorative marches took place to the Feldherrnhalle and the Temples of Honor, at which Hitler was always present. As it so happens, 2 attempts were made on Hitler's life during this very commemoration ceremony. One was by the Swiss theology student, Maurice Bavot, who attempted to shoot Hitler in 1938 during the march to the Feldherrnhalle, but did not have a clear shot. The other was by the Swabian carpenter, Georg Elser, who planted a bomb in the pillar in front of which Hitler always gave his speeches at the Bürgerbräukeller in 1939. However, Hitler left the hall earlier than expected, and the assassination attempt missed its target by only a couple of minutes. Both Bavot and Elsa paid for their efforts with their lives. Due to the danger posed by Allied air raids, the annual public commemoration march was discontinued after 1939. Following the liberation of Munich by the US Army in May 1945, the Temples of Honor were blown up and the plaque of the Feldherrnhalle was torn down, melted down, and then used to rebuild the Munich residence. The story of Hitler's coup is frustrating in many ways. On the one hand, because Hitler and his conspirators only had to serve a ridiculously lenient sentence, and the rule of law completely failed in this case. It is also incredibly frustrating that both the ban on the NSDAP and the ban on Hitler's speeches were lifted, even though they had so obviously demonstrated the danger they posed to democracy. For several years, this had initially no consequences, as the NSDAP remained a splinter party with only a small handful of supporters. This changed fatally only with the onset of the economic crisis in 1929. Here, an enemy of democracy took advantage of the platform that democracy itself had given him. And last but not least, it is hard to understand why the Bavarian triumvirate was not brought to justice at all. Because on those November days in 1923, the greatest danger to the Republic did not come from Hitler, but from the Bavarian elites, who had the Bavarian police and army behind them and enjoyed the goodwill of Hans von Ziegt. Their plans to overthrow democracy were ultimately thwarted simply by Hitler's impatience. This is illustrated by an absolutely ingenious caricature in the satirical magazine Simplicissimus about Hitler's trial. It shows Hitler standing on the shoulders of Kahr and Lossow to set fire to a house which represents Germany. Kahr calls out to an approaching policeman, "Officer, arrest the arsonist up there immediately." This image demonstrates that the German public was very much aware of the fact that the Bavarian elite had enabled Hitler's actions, only for them to then reject all responsibility. It was a great stroke of luck for the Republic that rebellious Bavaria was ultimately able to rejoin the German Confederation and that the conflict with the central government could be resolved. With such a disloyal army like the Reichswehr, the whole story could have ended very badly. But the Beerhall Putsch also offers some lessons to be learned. The most important one is probably that democracies are far more resilient than their opponents repeatedly claim. The fairy tale spread by the extreme right about the country's demise in hopeless chaos did not come true. The Weimar Republic emerged stronger from the crisis year of 1923 and then entered the so-called Golden Twenties, which were characterized by economic upswing, relative political stability, and cultural flourishing. Weimar would certainly have survived the global economic crisis as well if it had been led by a man who was genuinely interested in maintaining democracy and not someone like Paul von Hindenburg. This brings us to the second lesson, because democracy can only be preserved if its supporters are determined to defend it and do not give an inch to its enemies. Opponents of democracy and extremists cannot be negotiated with, nor can they be tamed. In light of the sad fact that more and more people are dissatisfied with democracy and may imagine dictatorship or military rule to be a better alternative, I would like to give the last word to the Italian historian Guglielmo Ferrero, who published an article in the Milanese magazine Secolo in 1923, in which he expressed his opinion on dictatorship. Under today's conditions, the pursuit of dictatorship, which is now so widespread among the educated and uneducated alike, is nothing more than a romantic form of despondency. Many seek a dictator because they hope that he knows what no one else knows, that he will find what everyone else is searching for in vain: the cure for the ills afflicting the world. The red or white dictator of people's dreams would have to be a magician of mysterious powers. Alright then, dankeschön for watching until the end. As you might know, making these videos is very difficult and time consuming, so if you want to make sure that I make more of them, please consider supporting me on Patreon. In exchange, you'll get access to a Patreon exclusive Discord server and, depending on your tier, a number of other sweet benefits like early access to my videos. In any case, I want to thank my invaluable supporters without whom none of this would be possible. Marius Gerling, Lida Titan, Der dicke Flipper, Ich liebe Emden und Groningen, Maurice Lopez, Lucy Tara I, Rabienka Horatska, A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Celestia, The Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drohle, Wiedweh, Pseudoriser, Lyle Furphy, Yin, Big Dave, Folling, Third Hand Bone, and Johnny No Cash. Have a very nice day, and I'll see you next time.